With today's sermon in our series, Exodus, Set Free to Follow God, here is Senior Pastor Mark Rader.
So if you've been following the story so far, you'll know that the author of Exodus has just dropped us into the action. And then assumed that we are familiar with and aware of the promises of God that have been actually driving the story all the way through. And he wants us to be aware of those because he makes a point of, at this point, not mentioning the promises of God explicitly. So in chapter 1, verse 7, when it talks about the fact that the Israelites multiplied and increased in numbers and filled the land, we are expected to realize that that's not just an interesting historical note, but it's a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham to make his descendants into a mighty nation. When the midwives, these Egyptian women who end up blessing the people of Israel and are themselves blessed, we should see not just a kind of a kind story of God being nice to them, but actually a fulfillment of the promise of God to Abraham to bless those who bless him, and also to bless all nations through him. We're expected to kind of be aware of the promise that rolls through the opening of this story. And it's important that we are aware of it because the author, as I said, has made a point of not pointing it out. In fact, apart from that small little reference to God being kind to the midwives in chapter 1, verse 20, God is noticeably absent from the narrator's telling of the story. In chapter 2, 1 to 10, this remarkable story of Moses' birth, God is not mentioned at all. But if you are like me, you suspect he may possibly be at work, don't you think? So let me kind of take you through the story really quickly and draw your attention to a few places where I suspect God may be at work and where I suspect the narrator wants us to see God at work, and then make a couple of comments about what that means for us. So the story, if you're unfamiliar with the background, is that the people of Israel have multiplied exponentially, and Pharaoh has now become fearful of their presence. And so he decides to act shrewdly, we're told. He decides to act wisely about them. And yet what's quite intriguing is that his wisdom has been twice thwarted already. His first attempt was to oppress the people, to keep them from multiplying by making them work really, really hard, by enslaving them. And what we're told in chapter 1 is that the more they were oppressed, the more they flourished. Now, the narrator doesn't tell us why that is, and we can come up with all sorts of reasons, but I think we're supposed to say that they were oppressed and flourished because God, right? The promises of God are rolling on apart from their oppression. His second plan then is to get the midwives on side to kill all the Hebrew baby boys when they're born. We're told that the midwives, though, fear God, which is the beginning of wisdom, and we find that they are much more wise in their interactions with the people of God than Pharaoh is in his attempt to be wise and shrewd, and so they undermine and undercut and undo his attempt. And so he brings into effect a third kind of wave of his pogrom against the people of Israel, where he broadens the command to kill all new baby boys born to the Hebrews to all of his people. They're all to be thrown into the Nile River. And the people of Egypt, we're told, dread the Israelites. They abhor them. They are fearful of them in the worst sense of the word. And so we can imagine that this is a lot more effective. The oppression was one thing, but they multiplied. The midwives undermined Pharaoh, and so his plans do not come to fruition. But here we suspect that things got a little bit worse for the people of Israel. And into this kind of darkness, we have this intriguing little story. A couple from the tribe of Levi, and if we're telling the same story again, if we're familiar with the story, we kind of smile and nod because the tribe of Levi becomes the priestly tribe, the tribe that was associated with the tabernacle and the worship of God. But this couple from the tribe of Levi fall pregnant with their third child. We find out later on that they have an older daughter named Miriam and an older son named Aaron, who are obviously old enough, and the boy is old enough to be kind of outside of the current legislation. But unfortunately, when she gives birth, it's a baby boy. And now they're stuck. What do they do with this child? Well, they don't automatically kill him, which is comforting, wouldn't you say? In fact, the reason why is because she sees that he was a fine child, which sounds like, well, it doesn't sound like the most overwhelming praise for a child, does it? And so it kind of caught my attention. I thought, I'm going to look and see what Hebrew word sits behind fine. And I found out that the word can be translated in a couple of different ways. One of them is beautiful. And I thought, well, that makes a little bit more sense. It's a beautiful child, although every mother thinks every child is beautiful, regardless of the objective reality of that. So that doesn't help us much. But the same Hebrew word is actually used all the way through Genesis chapter 1 and is translated good. It's the word that God used at the end of every day's work when he looked and he saw that it was good. And the idea of being good in chapter 1 of Genesis is not so much about saying, yes, I've done good work, or that that's beautiful. It's about something's aptness for its task. When God looked at the light and the darkness, given what he wanted the light and darkness to do, he said, that is good. That is the right thing for the purpose. It fits the task. Now, we have no idea what the task is for this child, if there is one, but it's an intriguing term nonetheless. For 3 months, they hide the child, and then it becomes impossible to do so anymore, which highlights again the danger that sits behind this story. And so the woman ends up making this papyrus boat, which is in the Hebrew actually called an ark. Now, the last time we encountered an ark was the great big giant boat that Noah built, in which there was salvation. Isn't it interesting that when she builds a little reed thing, it's called an ark? It's another little hint from the narrator to kind of go, watch this space. Not only is the child fine, but he's in an ark. We can guess how this story is going to begin to unfold. And she sets him amongst the reeds, and his older sister Miriam watches to see what will happen. And what happens next is really unfortunate, because the first person to see the ark, and keep in mind, the Nile would have been really busy. It was the source of fresh water. People would have been coming and going all the time. Placing the child in the ark and leaving him in the water was the ancient equivalent of leaving a child on the doorstep and doing the whole knock and run, right? It was the whole idea of saying, I can no longer provide for or care for my child, but I want my child to have the best, and so I'm going to hope in the kindness of strangers, right? Leave the child on the doorstep somewhere and see what happens. Places the ark in the water, and people are coming and going all the time, bathing and washing clothes and getting water and all of those sorts of things. And so isn't it remarkably ungood that Pharaoh's daughter is the first person to see the ark? I mean, the only person worse would have been Pharaoh himself. The Egyptians fear and dread the Israelites, and of all the people to understand her father's desire to act shrewdly, to understand the reasoning behind this horrific legislation, surely it would have been Pharaoh's daughter. If your Bible had pop-up ads in it at certain points in time, or if it went to commercial, now is when it would go to commercial. And you would spend the next 2 minutes wondering if you even want to watch how the story is going to unfold. This is not good at all. You can imagine Miriam standing in the reeds watching, heart in her throat. And so it's remarkably surprising what happens next. She sends her slaves to get the ark, brings it over, opens it up, and she recognizes it's a Hebrew baby. She's not confused. She doesn't say, oh, it's an Egyptian child and I've always wanted one. All right? She says, this is a Hebrew baby. Legislation says, throw it back. Right? That's how this all works. And what happens instead? She feels sorry for him. Now, crying babies tend to do that, don't they? Like, no one likes to watch a distraught child, right? But that's just, no one finds that enjoyable or fun, and I think our instinct is to try to comfort them. But this is a little bit remarkable, isn't it? One of the themes that we'll pick up in the weeks to come, if you're familiar with the story of Exodus, is God and people's hearts. and how God can strengthen people's hearts one way or the other, a theme that's found throughout Scripture, that God himself changes hearts. Do you think it might possibly be that God has changed her heart in the moment? It's plausible, certainly, isn't it? As plausible as the Jewish traditions are that this daughter of Pharaoh joined the Exodus and actually joined with the people. We have no evidence of that in the text, but it sounds plausible. So something's changed within her, and she takes the child and decides that she is going to raise the child on her own. And if there were a hall of fame for quick thinkers, in the inner sanctum, with the quickest thinkers of all thinkers, you would have Miriam, wouldn't you? And again, it's just remarkable. She rushes forward and she goes, "Oh, hey, hi. You don't happen to need a wet nurse for the child, do you?" "Oh, yeah, that'd be great," Pharaoh's daughter says. "Can you find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for me?" "I think so. I'll go see." Can you imagine her running back to her mother? I imagine her starting to laugh. That adrenaline-filled stress laugh that's just a total relief, where you're laughing at things that aren't actually all that funny, but you're so overwhelmed with emotion that you just start laughing. She had just watched Pharaoh's daughter take her brother out of the ark, heart in her throat, thinking that she was now going to see her brother die, and instead, he's going to be adopted by her. Right? Giggling all the way to Mom. "Mom, you are not going to believe what happened. Pharaoh's daughter." No, it's okay. How would you like a job? It's delightfully ironic, isn't it? There's the mother a few minutes later kneeling before Pharaoh's daughter, with Pharaoh's daughter saying, "Listen, would you take a job, and can I pay you to raise this child for me?" And she's kind of covering her face to make sure she doesn't start laughing out loud at the sheer delight of what's taken place. And now it may be that Miriam was simply an incredibly intelligent woman. But is it possible that she had a Spirit-inspired moment of brilliance? When you're under enormous stress, to be able to make that kind of leap, to make that kind of decision in the moment, that sounds suspiciously like God to me. Well, the story ends, at least this section of the story ends, with Moses being raised by his mother, then brought to the palace, named by Pharaoh's daughter, and raised within the confines of the royal palace, where we assume, although we're not told, but we assume that he learned to read and to write, and he learned the etiquette of the court, and he learned all the things that would then set him in good stead to play the role that he plays later on. Now, all the way through this, of course, God is not mentioned. But are you as suspicious as I am that he was probably at work nonetheless? All the way through it, right? And I think the narrator wants us to kind of play along, doesn't he? He uses the word "fine" to describe the child, which sounds to me like a wink and a nod, doesn't it? Hey, keep an eye on this. He uses the term ark to talk about the little papyrus reed basket. It's a basket. It's not an ark. But he calls it an ark and kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, pay attention to this. The timing, as you read it sounds like she put the ark in the river, turned to go home. Miriam's watching it, and Pharaoh's daughter's right there. It sounds like it happened right away. No washerwoman, no peasant, no other Egyptian, no other Hebrew, no one else finds it at a really busy river that was the very center of life, with people coming for water and going and washing and bathing. No one, just Pharaoh's daughter. Really? You expect me to believe that that's a coincidence? That her heart has changed within her, that Miriam has this moment of brilliance, that the boy ends up being raised in Pharaoh's court, the one who will ultimately destroy the entire country is raised by Pharaoh? That's just ironic. Try telling me that God is not at work here. His fingerprints are all over it, aren't they? They're all over it. And we suspect, rightly so, that this Moses kid has a big future. Don't we? We've all seen enough movies, we've all read enough stories to recognize a rags to riches story when we see one, right? unlikely kid raised by strange circumstances, miraculously saved, brought into the court. Oh, this is going to get good. And without ruining the story, he does have a fairly big role in what follows. Although it's not quite as linear as we might think it is, but we'll get to that in the weeks to come. But that's all well and good, isn't it? It's all great to look at a Bible story where we expect to see God, and even when he's not mentioned, we're kind of go, yeah, okay, I see your point. What is the invitation for you and I out of this text? Right? We've been talking about reading the Bible together as the people of God, as a community of faith, and we're asking these 3 questions, or 4 questions really, right? What stands out to you? What questions do you have? Who might you tell? And the 3rd question is the most important. What's the invitation that God might be extending to you? What might God be inviting you to do? If, as you're reading through the Bible with your friends and family and life group, if you're not getting to the 3rd question, stop answering all your questions along the way, leave them for now, and get to the invitation. Right? What stands out to me is that God is not mentioned. I've got questions about why you wouldn't just make it explicit. But the invitation, I think, that sits here just waiting for us to grasp it is this. If God is at work even when we can't see him, then that invites us to act as if he is already at work. If God is already at work when we can't see him, and keep in mind, we read this story, the narrator has not only left God out of it in terms of the explicit references, he also has left out the context of oppression and death. He's just compressed the story, hasn't he? We are not told how this couple responded when they found out that she was pregnant. We don't know how many times she prayed that it might be a little girl and not a little boy. We don't know the joy mixed with despair when it turns out that it was a little boy. Or the hopelessness when she sees that he is a fine child. We don't know the arguments that went back and forth about how long we can't hide this from the neighbors any longer. We don't know how many plans were thought of and hatched and schemed out and then ditched. We don't know how many tears were shed as she placed the child in that little papyrus basket and sent him out on the water, leaving him in the hands of God. We don't hear any of that in the story. And yet, God is at work. When things are good in our lives, it's pretty hard to see the hand of God, isn't it? And when things go bad, it's even harder. Our own pain, our own despair, our own hopelessness, our own doubts blind us to the presence of God. Like a mist that rises up, we're no longer able to see him. And so what do people cry out when God is absent in the midst of their pain? Where are you? Where are you? What does this story tell us? He's right there. He's right there. God is always at work, even when we can't see him. Even when Moses' mother, who we learn later is named Jochebed, even when Jochebed cannot see God's hand. Because keep in mind, this is not just a delightfully ironic story, right? It's not just, that's not all that's going on. For this woman and her family, there was no angel to say that this is going to be okay. There was no prophecy over the child to say that it will be okay. There was no dream that was interpreted to say this will be okay. There was nothing. There was no indicator for her at all that God had got this. Nothing. And so often we want absolute certainty before we take up the invitation of God to participate. I want absolute certainty. I want the angel, I want the dream, I want the prophecy. I want the burning bush. I want to know with 100% certainty that what is about to happen is exactly, precisely what God wants. And then, when I have absolute certainty, I will step out in faith. Did you hear the kind of what was wrong with that? Right? When I have absolute certainty, I will step out in faith. Isn't really the point of faith, is it? Faith says God is at work. Faith says, act like God is at work. Act like it. Act like God is at work. And so the invitation for us here is when we are at our workplaces, when we're at our occupation, and we have that moment, that sense in our spirit to say something, to ask, to offer, to serve, and we think, is this you, God? Just assume it is. Besides, if you serve someone with an intention to love, and if you speak to them in an intention to serve, and you're doing those sorts of things, I'm not sure God's going to be disappointed even if he's not involved. Is he? Oh, don't serve that person. Oh, now they think I love them. Faith says God's at work. So when you feel that prompting, assume that God's already been at work. When you feel that sense to ask that question, to offer, to pray, make that offer. Ask that question. Assume that God's been doing something amazing and incredible and coincidental in that person's life so that when you ask them, can I pray for you? And all of a sudden they well up with tears, it's because God's actually been at work. And when we act with faith, when we act with courage, you know what the result's going to be? The delightful, stress-releasing laughter of delight to see God's hand. When we join together on a Sunday morning or a Sunday evening and we have an opportunity to share the stories of God, there's going to be a little bit more laughter, I reckon. You would not believe what happened this week. So there I was, minding my own business, and I just felt the Spirit prompting me to do something, and I thought, maybe God's at work in this, and I said something, and boom, they came to faith, and I just laughed all day. The laughter of delight at God's already present activity in the world in which we live. God isn't waiting for you or me to take the first step. He's already taken the first step. He's waiting for us to respond to his invitation. In Hebrews 11, we're told that Moses' parents acted by faith when they hid him for 3 months. The author was able to look back and see in their actions some sense of faith, that there was something that was going to work out, that God was going to be at work. And so they acted with courage. And in the end, what they found was that God was indeed at work. God was indeed at work. God is at work. Even right now. Over the weekend, he's doing things in your life and in the lives of those in which you interact with. And you are about to be sent from this place back into your weeks, into your neighborhoods and workplaces and schools and families where God is already at work. Do you believe that? Do you believe that God is at work? Then act like it. Act like it. Don't wait for the certainty. Don't wait for the angel. Don't wait for something to burst into flame without being burnt up. Act like God is at work. And wait for the laughter as we see God's hand long before we got there and the small part that we get to play within it. Amen? Amen.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymere Baptist Church website. Go to guymerebaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymere Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
God is at work even when we can't see him, even when we're under oppression, even when things are hard and difficult and it seems utterly impossible. And faith gives us the courage to act as if God were indeed at work. What would you attempt this week if you knew that God was at work? Who would you speak to? Who would you seek to serve? What might you attempt if you knew for certain that God was at work? Well, through the eyes of faith, we believe that He is. So go for it. Work and step with courage in all that God has called you to. We hope to see you again real soon. God bless.